Thank you.
Okay. So how many interviews have you done?
I think I've done about 7.
Wow.
And I still wanted to speak with Tom Turner.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to speak with Frank Turner, who worked with the state,
Mm-hmm.
and he was the regulator, and he would get all the plans and go through the budget for them.
Now, do you need anybody from Pease's office? Because Mr. Joel Stiegel, who worked for Pease his entire career and would have been in Pease's office in the 50s, is still alive and kicking.
I don't think that I do, but
Okay.
actually it's probably not a bad thing to rule it out. I'm not really doing anything with
Yeah.
Carver College, but there is a letter in there from Norman P. Sr.,
Right.
and he's requesting, he states that he's interested in the Charlotte College
Mhm.
buildings, that he would like to design
Yeah.
them, but by that time they'd already made the...
And I don't know if Joel would have any memory of those projects, but I believe he was in Pease's office beginning in the 50s on through.
And he might have some insight into the selection process, how they
He-
did that for schools.
He might. Joel's specialization was specifications and technical details.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, that's what he spent his whole career doing. So, not a really nice guy.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess I'll just go on and start. Okay, so, that main question I wanted to ask you was something we just talked about,
Mhm.
but was that a typical way to select, to your knowledge, was that a typical way to select an architect for a project like that during that time frame?
And you want me looking at the camera? Where do you want me
You
looking?
can look at me. I think I'm close enough to the camera where it's fine.
Well, in the 1950s, it wasn't unusual for, on occasion, formal proposals will be sent out for given projects. It was also not unusual for individual architects to be contacted directly by clients and selected for a project, especially if they knew them on a local level or had they were familiar with their architecture and they knew that they were designing the kind of buildings that the client wanted.
Do you think that, what would the inclination have been for Pease and Odell to be selected for these projects?
The attraction in Charlotte for both Pease's office and Odell's office they were both identified with modern architecture. And I think Charlotte was clearly positioning itself. The phrase that, of course, is now used is a new South city, a city identified with modernism, with the emerging technology following the close of the Second World War. And so you had the two leading modernist firms in Charlotte. I think that was the drive for a lot of people. This was modern architecture. This was very, very important.
What would have been the community's response to that? Would they have been excited that it's a new style and, previously rural environment, or what would they have thought? How do you think the buildings would have been received?
I think the public's response to modernism in Charlotte in the 1950s, I think, would have been very similar to the response across the country. We were building the first glass and steel skyscrapers in New York City. We were building the first modern schools across the country. Modern architecture was very much, I think, associated with the gradual economic boom of the 1950s. America's obsession with sort of things modern. What's intriguing is at the same time, people were increasingly going to work in modern environments. They were returning to very traditional homes. And there are some observers who speculated that in fact, that conservative environment of the home made it easier to have that modern environment that you went to work or that your children were educated in, because you had this balance between this modern new world and then the safety of the conservative environment of the home. So I think Charlotteans' reaction to it was fairly typical. This was, it was that vibrancy of the 1950s, the sort of excitement of technology. By the time we get to the point of Charlotte College, the Korean War is over, the Korean conflict rather is over, and we're moving into this sort of really dynamic age.
How does Charlotte College fit into the larger context of what was going on with academic architecture? Is it unusual? Is it typical?
The buildings that were proposed for Charlotte College were as normative and as typical as you can possibly have modern buildings be. They fit that mold perfectly. In that regard, in some ways, they are not unique. You could take university buildings from across the country, and if you look at the architectural periodicals and you see them, they look exactly like what everyone else was doing. And to a certain extent, that makes sense. We weren't doing unique or sort of strange modern architecture in Charlotte, because Charlotte, for all its desire to be modern, if we look at the economic base of Charlotte, even in the 1950s, the banks were here. They were just beginning, but the banks are here. As a southern community, Charlotte's slightly more conservative, perhaps. So, sort of right down the middle, mainstream modernism made perfect sense for Charlotte.
That reminded me of some of what I've been reading across in the correspondence, that there's this request for a shiny new campus.
Right.
So that really goes along with that.
Yeah, and one of the incredible opportunities that was presented in Charlotte College was something that architects just kill for: a blank slate, a blank piece of ground with no context to respond to, and so we get to build something new. And this is an extraordinary opportunity for architects. You almost never get that. You almost always have to respond to older buildings or an existing context. So this was an opportunity to create this incredibly new thing, this new learning environment.
As far as back to the selection again, and Odell being selected for that, do you think, partly, yes, he was a modernist, but also he had established himself. Do you think that he stands out as, what type of architect, looking back on it, was Odell? I mean, was he in it for the business? Was he primarily a business-motivated architect who did, what he had to do to be successful? It's fine.
Let me just see who it is, and then I can. Give me just 1 second.
Yeah.
Hello.
Okay.
Odell is probably one of Charlotte's most interesting architectural characters in the true sense of that word. An incredibly strong personality, an incredibly powerful commitment to modern architecture, to the point that sometimes I feel if Odell could have torn down every single old building in Charlotte, he would have. And because he felt that he needed to remake Charlotte as a modern city. Now, having said that, the firm was obviously very successful, many, many buildings, and under his leadership, the firm grew to be one of the largest firms in the city of Charlotte and one of the largest firms in the region. So, as a business person, both himself and by sort of, very careful hiring of associates coming into the firm, he clearly managed the business very well. But certainly as an architect, he's defined by his commitment to modernism, and his was one of those personalities that when he walked into a room, he immediately would have commanded the room.
Do you think that he would have been selected with that business perspective in mind, that he would be able, because there were all these budgetary constraints from the state, do you think he was selected because they knew he would be able to keep costs down, or was it twofold, because it would be a modernist style campus and also keep costs down? Because it's clear in just what I've been going through that he did make efforts to keep costs down, and he did what he was supposed to do.
Well, one of the advantages of engaging someone like Odell, and the same could be said of Pease, but Odell also had been involved in designing many of Charlotte's schools. And those are buildings that, elementary schools and high schools and so on, and those are buildings that have very, very tight budget constraints. They do today, they certainly did at that time. So Odell, there's no question that he knew how to do an academic building, and he knew how to work with not just municipal governments, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, but also with the state government and working within existing budgets. So there's no question that that knowledge helped him.
That being said, the firm that worked with him, the educational consulting firm, Engelhardt, Leggett and Cornell.
Right.
In my research, I found several articles written by this Frank G. Lopez, and
Right.
his philosophy is architecture is meant to challenge the mind and inspire.
Right.
And so I found it interesting that he's actually one of the lower downs in the firm during this
Mhm.
time period.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that firm would have been selected based on that philosophy, or was it just because they were well-noted educational consultants during the time?
The selection of Leggett, and
Or, yeah, Engelhardt, Leggett, and Cornell.
okay, yeah, which
Because they were known for having this philosophy of a modern school can challenge
right.
the mind of a student.
One of the things that characterizes architecture in the 1950s, especially educational design, not just educational design perhaps, but is architects actively seeking knowledge related to the kind of building they're designing. And one of the things we find in the 1950s in educational buildings, very specifically, a number of books come out on the design of educational buildings produced by either consultants in the world of education or architects. And we know that these were on the architect shelves. They sought knowledge to contribute to their design skills to produce buildings. And it is something that is not quite unique to this time, but is a characterization of it. I mean, they would bring in consultants, and the consultants almost always supported a modernist aesthetic because they were aligned with the architects in thinking that new educational ideas matched modern architecture. So this actually bolstered the architect's argument for why we need to do a modern building, because these educational specialists say this is the best kind of environment to place these young people in. It's a very smart move on the part of Odell and other architects to do this. And also in the case of Charlotte, if we look at the growth of the Charlotte and Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system, I believe in the 1950s when Dr. Geringer was superintendent of the school system, at that point in time, the leadership of the school system, and by extension, the emerging leadership of the community college and Charlotte College, recognized that you don't just need good design expertise, bring in all the expertise you can. So it's a very interesting confluence of specialists who come into play.
Do you agree with that philosophy, that architecture can challenge the mind and create a better environment for learning?
There's no question that good architecture can provide dynamic environments that can enhance someone's experience. Now, is that going to make someone a better student? That I'm not sure about. There's no question though that there are buildings when people enter, either by their just organization, they're just easy to walk through, they're easy to understand, it's easy to find your classroom so you're immediately comfortable. The quality of light coming in to the classroom is just right. You're engaged with the outside, but yet it's not interfering. There are clearly rooms that we like to be in as people. If you design classrooms that people like to be in, the light is good, the proportions of the space are comfortable, you are going to immediately have an enhanced environment that will facilitate good learning, which of course is predicated on a good teacher. You've got to have a good teacher, but if you put a good teacher in a good environment, then you're more than halfway there.
One of the things that reminds me is one of the city planners that visited Charlotte in the late 90s. He visited the campus and he was walking up one of the rails, the original rails by the Cone building, and he said a lot of what a building is how it makes you feel. How do you feel when you're inside of that space? And he thought it was interesting because the rail, this is a story Dr. Mole told me, the rail was designed at an angle so that if you weren't careful, you might cut your hand as you're going up using that rail. And he said he thought that was interesting because Odell was more interested in the design and the style of the way it looked, that he wasn't thinking about use for that handrail. So how do you think the Do those Charlotte College buildings fit that? What do you think about the Charlotte College buildings?
The, I mean, the Charlotte College buildings as examples of modernist architecture are, for the most part, decidedly average. They're fine. They're not great buildings. There are some wonderful moments on campus. The original Denny Geringer complex, the courtyard that is defined by those buildings, low two-story buildings, the courtyard that they make is perfectly scaled for those buildings. It is a beautifully made space. Part of the challenge, of course, is as the college grew, those low buildings only make very small spaces. The heart of the campus remains a huge problem in this undefined or ill-defined amorphous kind of space that lacks a lot of character. So there's some wonderful modernist moments on campus. Most of the buildings are they're sort of very competent, solid, modern buildings, very typical of the time. They're the kind of thing in a historic preservation district you would want to keep, not because they're great buildings, but because they make up the, if you look at historic districts, you save lots of average buildings because they define the character and provide the backdrop for those really extraordinary buildings in historic district. That's what we have here. There are some moments where the average person looks at it and goes, why does it look that way? Why did they do that? And sometimes architects, it's about the design and the appearance. And people will say, well, it doesn't work well or it doesn't function. All buildings work. Some buildings work better than others.
How do you think those buildings are significant for Charlotte's history? I mean, on a more national scale, it's representative of everything is going on at the time in architecture. But here, do you think it's an important part of the story of the Charlotte and the new South City, or?
There's no question that the Charlotte College original campus and the current UNC Charlotte campus are an important part of Charlotte's history. What is perhaps most interesting about that history is if you trace it from those original modernist buildings in the 1950s through buildings that get designed in the 60s and 70s, a couple in the 80s, and then the early 90s, and then the shift that takes place in design on campus under Chancellor Jim Woodward, where we get more sort of classically inspired buildings. This campus is, on one level, a sort of a perfect sort of microcosm of every single architectural movement that has taken place in the country since the 1950s. We don't have quite one of everything, but it's pretty close. So as a collection of buildings, it's very interesting. I think its importance to Charlotte is that, and to a certain degree, again, there are other examples like this, but if we think about other universities within the state of North Carolina, and some of our sister institutions are similar, we are a completely modern campus. We have some pretend old buildings, if you will, done with columns and so on, but they're not old buildings. And they really don't look like old buildings. If you know anything about classical architecture and real authentic classical academic buildings, they're just kind of dress up stuff.
What do you think the university's stance should be? And this is a big political question, but what should the university's stance be on the future of these buildings?
One of the big challenges that the university faces is what to do with the low two-story academic buildings, Denny, Geringer, and so on. For a modern university and a modern campus, regrettably, they are too small. They are very difficult to renovate, and you can only renovate them to a certain point, and you're limited by the physical shell of the building. It would not surprise me in the next 10 to 15 years if they were all torn down and replaced by much larger modern buildings. to meet the needs of the campus, that is probably what we need to do. One building that very likely could be preserved because of the effort that's being put into it is the Kennedy Building, which in fact would be good. It was one of the original buildings on campus. It has the most architectural character in many ways. The original part of the library, the Atkins Library, that will probably remain. It would be a shame to lose the Denny Complex on one hand. On the other hand, to meet the needs of future students, we have to put a big building someplace. We need a major classroom building. We need new laboratory buildings. From a historic preservation point of view, they probably won't be missed. Sad to say.
Oh, this Frank G. Lopez. Do you know anything about
Not
him?
a clue.
Okay, yeah. And I guess there were a lot of people like him who
Yeah.
had these ideas and wrote. Talking a little bit more about Odell, what makes him successful? What makes him memorable other than his personality and some of his most significant buildings in the city? And
I think what the two things that make A.G. Odell most memorable, or perhaps three things. One is the force of his personality. Anyone, and I did not have the pleasure of meeting him. He passed away before I came to Charlotte. But anyone who met him or was associated with him has a story about the force of his personality, about his sports car, about his love of modern architecture. He was, again, an incredibly unique character. His contributions to architecture, though, I think can really be summed up with two things. One, the original Charlotte Coliseum complex. Innovative, unique designs in many, many ways. I would say those are his best modern buildings. A lot of the work that came out of Odell's office was very good, competent modern architecture. The original Coliseum complex was unique for this region, and the fact that it remains after the second Coliseum, built and now destroyed, and the original is still there and is still used and is still a vital part of Charlotte. That's an incredible contribution. His second major contribution was the urban plan that his office developed in the mid-1960s to redesign Charlotte as a modern city. That is a remarkable achievement in that you can trace its impact on the city all the way through to today. And if you study that plan carefully, everything from in the 1960s, he says a major football stadium should go right here in Charlotte. He only missed by a couple of blocks where we put Panther Stadium. And you can go on and on and on through that plan. It was a remarkable vision that even though, and I've now lost track, since that plan I think we have done 7 or 8 urban design plans for the city of Charlotte. We're always planning here. We're always trying to do something. The echo of that plan continues to be there. It is truly remarkable.
That'll be really good because then I can segue into some of those pieces of that. Talking a little bit about why modern architecture was a good choice for a suburban campus like Charlotte College. Why was that? For driving and cars and is there any connection there between? Okay.
Not really.
Okay. We already sort of touched on this, but what, if anything, makes them significant architecturally, these buildings? I know Kennedy, the first building, and then has that little portico, but is there anything in your mind that makes them stand out?
Perhaps the most interesting of the modern buildings on the Charlotte College campus is the Kennedy Building, because with its portico-like element in front, you could perhaps make the argument that it is the modernist interpretation of a traditional classical campus building, because it has a kind of portico, not classical columns, but interpreted in a modernist language. You can relate it to other streams of modernism in the 1950s, the work of Edward Durrell Stone would be a good example. So it has the strongest architectural character. The other buildings on campus are very good examples of how you did modernist buildings in the 1950s. The facades are very typical. The interior organization is very typical. You literally could lift up those buildings and put them on any campus designed in the 1950s across the country and swap them out, and no one would know the difference. Kennedy's a little more unique with the portico on it, and it's sort of lifted up off the ground. From an architectural point of view, it's clearly the best building done on this campus from that period.
Talking about other campuses that were roughly 10 years earlier, Wake Forest was moving to a new site and having
Right.
a new campus.
Right.
And they chose to go with that traditional revival style architecture. And they got a lot of flack for it across the state. How typical would that have been? I mean, would that have been like a unique example where they were using this revival style when modernism was so popular? Or
In the 1950s, there are some examples of campuses in North Carolina. Wake Forest is one example where the leadership of the university made a decision to go with a more conservative and traditional revival style architecture. In most instances, that was more the exception than the rule. Often what you find in those situations is either the leadership of the college simply saying, this is who we have been, because the university has already been there, and this is who we will continue to be. Or sometimes it comes from an external source. Who is providing the money? A donor has very specific wishes. They may have a connection to the university and to its past and are willing to provide support if a certain architect is hired or a certain style is followed. Typically it has to do with the perceived mission of the university.
can you talk just briefly about Dean Camp Hefner and how modernism sort of trickled into North Carolina and the impact that the School of Design had on the state?
One of the primary conduits for modern architecture in North Carolina in the 1950s was the School of Design at North Carolina State University. And Henry Camp Hefner was the dean of that school, and he and Odell are interesting parallels in that Odell was a staunch advocate of modern architecture. Camp Hefner matched him word for word and emphasis for emphasis. Camp Hefner did a remarkable job, and here we have to remember, at a southern university, when Camp Hefner arrives at North Carolina State, architecture is in the College of Engineering. It's basically architectural technology with a strong engineering basis. And during his tenure at North Carolina State, Camp Hefner hired an incredible roster of faculty, all committed to modern architecture. Camp Hefner convinced an incredible array of leading modern architects to come spend time in Raleigh, North Carolina, of all places, hardly the center of the universe at this period of time, to spend time here, to teach students, and almost single-handedly, Camp Hefner created what became known as one of the leading modernist schools of architecture in the entire Southeast, if not in the entire Eastern Seaboard. It was a remarkable achievement. And the graduates that came out of that program were indoctrinated with, well, there's only one way to design, and that's modern architecture. And they fan out across North Carolina and across the Southeast.
Do you think that Odell and Camp Hefner would have had a lot of interaction, or would it mostly have been through journals and ideas of that sort?
The architectural climate, certainly in the 1950s in North Carolina, was it was a close-knit community. Camp Hefner would often go out and speak to the local American Institute of Architecture meetings. He came to Charlotte several times and spoke. He would have been involved at the state level with the American Institute of Architects other organizations. I feel quite confident that he and Odell knew each other. They would have gone to many similar meetings, and would have seen each other as allies in a cause. And another thing that, and I'm obviously speculating here, that would have made their friendship in many ways easy is they were not competitors. Camp Hefner was not in practice. He was not going after commissions that Odell was. And it's much easier to be a friend when they're not competing with you. And knowing Odell's competitive nature, that probably facilitated that relationship. Now that's pure speculation.
Where do you think Odell's passion for modernism came from? Where did he, through school, through travels?
Odell's passion for modernism in some ways is typical of many people of his generation, but, and again, speculating on this, he attends Cornell University to study architecture at a point in time when Cornell was in transition from a sort of an École de Beaux-Arts centered classical training in architecture to a more modern perspective. Odell does go to France, continues his education there, but we have to remember that in the 1930s, when you went to France, the majority of the work was traditional Beaux-Arts classical architecture, but you also had modernist architects running around Paris, Le Corbusier and others. There were examples of modern architecture that Odell could have sought out. When he returns to the United States, he goes to work for a firm in New York City, one of the leading modernist firms in America. There weren't many at the time, but he ends up there. So clearly at some point, either before leaving, I believe, Concord, North Carolina, to go off to school, something flipped that switch and he became interested in modern architecture, or it could have been a professor at Cornell, it could have been an experience in Paris. Somewhere that switch flipped. And there's no question that when he returns, he's committed to that. Otherwise, he would not have sought out employment in New York City, working with a firm that specializes in modern architecture. And so it's hard to tell where that came from. If I had to guess, it probably would have been a professor at Cornell, or thinking about the way education works, could have been a magazine. Cornell, Ivy League institution, even at that time, one of the best architectural libraries in the country. They would have had all the magazines, leading magazines, not just the American magazines, the European ones as well. It was very easy for students to get access to those things. And it is not unusual to find either a professor or a student reading a book, picking up a magazine, seeing something they've never seen before, and the response is, oh my God, this is the greatest thing. And then they pursue that interest. Guessing, I think it's a confluence of all of those. Probably a good faculty member, being exposed to all those things for the first time, the opportunity to then work in Paris, the opportunity to work in New York, built in a really sort of wonderful way for Odell.
My speculation reading about that firm, and I can't recall his boss's name.
I'm blanking on the name.
I can't recall
too.
it, but he would wear designer suits and he drove sports cars, and so that led me to believe that Odell was impacted.
I think there's no question that Odell, living in New York, when you got the creation of the Museum of Modern Art, you've got New York as a sort of a mecca for modern art. You've got people interested in modern architecture. You have this incredible collection of modern buildings done in the 1930s. It's New York. I mean, it's this. It was then, as it is today, this incredibly dynamic environment that you cannot be involved with and not come away unscathed or unaffected or not influenced in one way or the other.
Is there anything I haven't asked that you think is relevant to say?
As my stomach rumbles away.
Breakfast. I'm interested about, the relationship between Pease and Odell, but I don't want to go too much into it because I'm not doing any work on Harvard College.
I mean, the
competitiveness between the two firms.
I mean, my understanding is that, from what I understand, they didn't actively dislike each other, but they didn't seek each other out to socialize. They perceived themselves as very much competitors. And so, I mean, I have heard some stories that, they really didn't talk to each other. And again, I don't think they disliked each other. They just didn't talk to each other. But same goes for Hook. I mean, the research I've done into the founding of the Charlotte Council of Architects, the first formal organization for architects in the city of Charlotte that later becomes AIA Charlotte, is the primary driving members behind creating that organization were all of the younger architects. The old guys they really weren't that interested. Now, Odell goes on to become national president of the American Institute of Architects, so he clearly recognized the value of those associations. But, at a local level, very, very competitive. And so I don't think there was, open animosity. I just think, and part of it was they were two very powerful personalities. And, to design a building and spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, you have to have a pretty healthy ego to have the confidence necessary to do that. And one of the things that my understanding of Odell's firm is he was the boss. Everybody else worked for him. Nobody worked with him. Everybody worked for him. Pease, I'm not quite so sure about the environment there, but when you take two people who are accustomed to being the most important person in the room, this can lead to an interesting dynamic when you get them together.
Mm-hmm. I've heard in interviews with the Observer where Odell says that phrase, that architecture is 90% business and 10% art. And I was looking through one of these books and I found where Albert Kahn had said it earlier, so I guess he picked up on that, and he would say it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess that's all I really have.
Okay.
I can't think of anything else.
Well, I mean, obviously, if you think of something else, you
come
know where I live. I just have to remember to wear the same blue shirt.
That's right. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.